It happened 2 years ago, when I was working the night shift as a security guard in a large shopping mall's underground parking garage. The job was straightforward. Patrol the garage a few times throughout the night, make sure everything was in order, and ensure no one unauthorized entered the area. The parking garage was massive, spanning 3 levels with hundreds of parking spaces. But after midnight, the place was almost entirely deserted. Just an empty, echoing space with only the dim glow of the flickering overhead lights. To be honest, I never liked working the night shift. The atmosphere in the underground garage was unnerving, especially in the dead of night. The vast, empty space, the distant, barely lit shadows in the corners. It always felt like someone, or something, was lurking in the darkness, watching me from afar. But I needed the job, and the pay was decent, so I gritted my teeth and got through it. That night was like any other. At around 1 a.m., I left the security room to do my usual patrol. The parking garage was eerily quiet, just like every other night. Occasionally, I could hear faint mechanical noises from the mall above, but apart from that, there was nothing but the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. I shone my flashlight across the rows of empty parking spaces, the beam bouncing off the cold concrete and casting long, dark shadows on the walls. I had nearly completed my patrol when something caught my eye. My flashlight's beam landed on a figure, someone standing in the far corner of the parking garage near the wall. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was a woman. She was standing still, facing away from me, wearing an old-fashioned white dress that looked completely out of place. Her hair was long and disheveled, hanging down her back. She wasn't moving, just standing there, motionless. A sense of unease washed over me. It was 1 a.m., and the parking garage should have been empty. There were no customers at this hour, and certainly no reason for a woman to be standing alone in the corner of the lot, especially dressed like that. I shone my flashlight directly on her, but she didn't react. She just stood there, still as a statue, her back to me. I walked a few steps closer, my voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "Ma'am, do you need help?" I called out. No response. She didn't even flinch. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. Something wasn't right. I took a few more steps toward her, trying to get a better look. The closer I got, the more I noticed how out of place she seemed. Her dress was old, worn, and her shoes were scuffed and dirty. She looked like she had stepped out of a different era. "Ma'am, the parking garage is closed. If you need assistance, I can help you," I said louder this time. Still nothing. She remained completely motionless, her back rigid, as if she hadn't heard me at all. My anxiety spiked, and I considered whether I should get closer or call for backup. But before I could make a decision, she suddenly moved. Without warning, she sprinted away, darting toward the far end of the garage. The speed of her movement caught me off guard. It was unnaturally fast, almost inhuman. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in shock. Then my instincts kicked in, and I ran after her. But something strange happened. As I chased her, her footsteps made no sound, no echo, nothing. Only my own footsteps reverberated through the empty garage. She was heading toward the farthest corner of the lot, a dead end with no exit. I thought I had her cornered. When I reached the end of the garage, she was gone. I stopped, panting, and shone my flashlight around. There was nowhere she could have gone. No doors, no exits, no cars. The entire area was empty, save for a few dust-covered vehicles. The chill in the air intensified, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. How had she disappeared? I was certain she had run toward this corner. I swept my flashlight over the area once more, searching every shadow, every crevice. But there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The silence in the garage felt oppressive, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I turned and hurried back to the security room, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door. Once inside, I went straight to the surveillance monitors. I needed to see the footage, to confirm that I hadn't imagined it. I rewound the footage to the time when I first saw the woman and watched it carefully. To my growing horror, the footage only showed me. There was no woman, no shadow, nothing but me walking through the garage, shining my flashlight. I stood there in disbelief, my skin crawling. I had clearly seen her. She was there. I had chased her, but the cameras showed nothing. It was like she had never existed. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. The parking garage was empty. It had always been empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, something I wasn't supposed to see. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to patrol the far corners of the garage during my shifts. Every time I passed the area where I had seen her, a cold shiver would run down my spine, and I'd feel that same unsettling presence lingering in the shadows, as if she was still there, watching. I quit that job a few months later. To this day, I can't explain what I saw that night. I don't know if she was a ghost or some kind of hallucination, but I'm certain of one thing. Something or someone was in that garage with me, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be found. That empty parking garage, with its endless shadows and flickering lights, still haunts me. I often wonder how many others have seen her, and how many more might encounter that strange, silent figure in the night, only to have her vanish into the darkness. It happened during my first week working the night shift at a large logistics company. The job seemed simple enough, just patrolling the warehouse, organizing inventory, and occasionally handling paperwork. The warehouse itself was massive, but the lighting was dim, giving the space an eerie, shadowy feel. Late at night, the place felt even more oppressive, almost like a maze of silence. There was something about that warehouse that was unsettling, especially during the late hours. The air always felt damp and cold, and every now and then I could hear the wind howling faintly through the ventilation shafts, creating a low, haunting whistle that made the quiet even more pronounced. I tried not to think about it too much and just focused on getting my work done. The incident occurred on a Thursday night during the early hours of the morning. I was alone, patrolling the aisles between the shelves of stacked goods. The whole place was dead silent, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty space. Just as I was about to finish my rounds, I suddenly heard a faint knocking sound in the distance, like someone was gently tapping on the walls. I froze for a second, a surge of unease washing over me. At that hour, there shouldn't have been anyone else in the warehouse, and the sound was too deliberate to be mechanical or caused by the building settling. I stood still for a moment, straining to listen. The knocking continued, intermittent, as if coming from deep within the warehouse. Feeling a growing sense of anxiety, I decided to check it out. After all, if someone had somehow snuck into the warehouse, it was my responsibility to investigate. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I began walking toward the source of the noise. The farther I went, the darker the warehouse became. The lights at the back were dimmer, barely illuminating the shelves and casting long, creeping shadows. The knocking continued, but it seemed to be moving, like it was coming from different areas of the warehouse, as if someone, or something, was walking through the aisles, tapping on the walls as they went. I quickened my pace, trying to catch up, but each time I thought I was close, the sound would shift again, leading me deeper into the warehouse. Before I realized it, I had reached the very back of the building, a section that was rarely used and filled with old, dusty goods. The shelves here were covered in a thick layer of grime, and the floor had a faint coating of dust that hadn't been disturbed in months. The air was colder here, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me. The knocking had stopped. I stood there, shining my flashlight around. The beam illuminated the rows of forgotten boxes and rusted equipment, but there was nothing unusual. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine and decided it was time to head back. But just as I turned to leave, I heard it again. This time, the knocking was louder, sharper, as if someone was banging on the wall right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight darting wildly across the shelves, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The sound had been so close, I was sure of it, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. Then, out of nowhere, I heard faint footsteps. They were soft but distinct, coming from the opposite end of the warehouse. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't just the echo of my own steps. Someone, or something, was moving around in the dark. I scanned the area again, but everything was still, the aisles empty and untouched. At that point, my nerves were shot. I didn't care to investigate further. I quickly turned around and made my way back toward the front of the warehouse, my footsteps quick and nervous. As I approached the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, its presence lingering just out of sight. The air around me felt heavy, and the coldness seeped deeper into my bones. Just before I reached the exit, I felt an overwhelming urge to look back. Against my better judgment, I did. And that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light at the far end of the warehouse. It was there for only a second, a fleeting glimpse, but I was sure I saw it. The figure moved swiftly, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait around to confirm what I had seen. I bolted out of the warehouse, heart racing, and locked the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I stayed holed up in the security room, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. When my shift finally ended, I was out of there as fast as I could. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The knocking, the footsteps, and that shadow, it was all too real. A few days later, I requested a shift change to avoid working the night shift. I wasn't willing to take any chances in that warehouse again. Later on, I heard other night shift workers talk about similar experiences. Some said they'd heard knocking too, while others claimed to have seen strange shadows moving between the shelves. No one had a clear explanation for what was going on, but everyone agreed there was something not right about that warehouse, especially at night. To this day, I still don't know what I saw or heard that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of being followed through that dark, empty space. Whatever was in that warehouse, I was certain it didn't want to be found. It happened last winter when I was working the night shift as a security guard for a small, isolated company. The building was located along a quiet road in the outskirts, with very few buildings around. Even during the day, there was hardly any traffic, and at night, it felt eerily desolate. The company had a 3-story office building, and at night, it was completely empty except for me. Most nights, I would sit in the security office, watching the surveillance cameras. Occasionally, I would patrol the building, checking the doors and windows, but for the most part, it was a quiet and uneventful job. That night, it was particularly cold, and a strong wind was howling outside, rattling the windows every now and then. I sat at my desk, sipping hot coffee and watching the surveillance screens, which showed nothing but empty hallways and offices. The time was around 2 a.m., and I was just about to get up for my routine patrol when I suddenly heard faint, heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze for a moment, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps were soft but unmistakable, echoing in the dead silence of the night. What made my heart race was the fact that no one was supposed to be upstairs at this hour. My pulse quickened as I scanned the camera feeds again, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The second floor was empty, just as it should be. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously stepped out of the security room and began ascending the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was cold, and the wind made eerie whistling sounds through unseen cracks. My palms were starting to sweat as I gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to keep my composure. I told myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over or a door left slightly ajar. But when I reached the second floor, the footsteps started again, louder this time and much closer. I stood at the far end of the hallway, listening intently. The sound was coming from one of the offices down the corridor. Then I heard the faint creak of a door closing. I held my breath and slowly approached the office where the sound had come from. My footsteps were nearly silent on the floor as I reached the door, which was slightly ajar, the room inside cloaked in darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest as I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open with the flashlight. As the beam of light swept across the room, a cold chill ran down my spine. Standing there by the window was a man I didn't recognize. He had his back to me, seemingly rifling through some papers on the desk. I didn't call out right away, my mind racing to figure out who this person was and how he had gotten inside. He was wearing a black jacket, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence exuding a quiet threat. He hadn't noticed me yet, still focused on whatever he was doing. Taking a deep breath, I finally mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" My voice echoed in the empty room, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. The man froze for a second before slowly straightening up. He turned his head toward me, and when our eyes met, a wave of cold fear washed over me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and distant, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with an expression so cold and emotionless that it sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if he was silently accusing me of being the one who shouldn't be there. Before I could react, he suddenly darted toward the window. His movements were unnervingly quick, and I barely had time to process what was happening. He threw the window open and jumped out before I could even shout. I rushed to the window and looked down, expecting to see him in the narrow alley below, but he was already gone. Only the cold wind rushed in, biting at my face, and I could feel my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I stood there stunned, my mind racing. Who was this man? Why had he broken in, and how had he disappeared so quickly? I closed the window, locking it securely, and hurried back to the security office to call the police. They arrived shortly after, searching the building and the surrounding alleyways, but they found nothing. The intruder had vanished without a trace. The only evidence that someone had been there were faint footprints on the windowsill where he had jumped. The police checked the surveillance footage, but strangely enough, there was no sign of anyone entering or leaving the building. Even when I had opened the door and seen him, the cameras hadn't captured his presence. What was even more disturbing was the fact that, according to the building's layout, there was no alley below the window where he had jumped. That window should have led to a solid brick wall. No escape route, no way out. And yet I had seen him leap out and disappear. I tried to explain what I had witnessed to my colleagues and my boss, but they dismissed it as an attempted break-in, saying the intruder had likely found a hidden escape route. They didn't believe my story about the disappearing alleyway or the strange behavior of the man. But I know what I saw. I watched him jump out of that window, even though there shouldn't have been anywhere for him to go. Since that night, I've become much more cautious during my patrols, especially around the second floor. Every time I pass by that office, a deep chill settles over me, as if the memory of that man still lingers there, waiting by the window. His empty, hollow eyes, and the way he moved with such eerie speed, haunt me every time I think about it. I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night wasn't entirely human. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.